As Ukraine is queuing to become a member of NATO, the Hungarian Deputy Parliament Speaker has said the alliance should only approve Kiev's bid if Russia endorses it. Well, let's cross live now to the Hungarian Deputy Parliament Speaker, Dúró Dóra. Pleasure to have you on RT today, Dúró Dóra. Thanks very much for joining us. Now, your remark about the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO only with Moscow's approval was certainly interesting. What was your thinking behind it?
Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, my party and me believe that the accession of Ukraine to NATO poses a huge threat to the international security environment. This could only happen without the risk of further escalation if both the USA and Russia reach an agreement on this issue. Mm-hmm. Of course, an agreement must be made which would mean the end of the war and could clarify all the disputed questions. We should make it clear that the most important issue is to regain peace, which should have priority. But Ukraine's officials are talking about such absurdities as the elimination of Russia. This is not going to happen, so we have to take reality into account. Russia is a huge empire on the borders of the European Union and the NATO, and it will remain after the war as well.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think the chances are of Moscow ever giving the green light to Ukraine's NATO membership? They would seem extremely small.
Of course, this scenario seems unlikely now, as both sides believe that they can win this war on the battlefield. Ukraine's total defeat has not happened so far only because of the Western military supplies, so we cannot assess Ukraine as an independent actor, but a belligerent participant of proxy war between the USA and Russia. Unfortunately, I must say that Europe subordinates its own interest to US interests, and Ukraine cannot see the reality. Mm-hmm. So the agreement is a long way off, and the US policy is not helping to bring us any closer.
So just staying with the topic of NATO, how do you assess the chances of Ukraine ever actually becoming a member of the alliance?
We consider the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO to be out of the question. It is absolutely certain that my party when it comes to vote, will reject this initiative. Furthermore, as long as Ukraine's borders are disputed and an armed conflict is ongoing, NATO's own provisions rule out the joining of Ukraine to the NATO. But even if this obstacle was removed, we would still not be able to support the enlargement because minority rights are constantly being violated in Ukraine, which is totally unacceptable for us. Mm-hmm. Until the Ukrainian government removes Hungarian monuments, flags, and texts, and ban the use of the Hungarian language in everyday life, including education and public administration, and terrorizes the leaders of the Hungarian community in Transcarpathia, our party cannot see any chance of supporting Ukraine's accession to any international organization.
Mm-hmm. In theory, do you think that NATO membership would make Ukraine safer or raise the risk of a further serious conflict?
Well, the risk of the war spreading is the greatest threat facing Europe today. And as I see it, that the NATO membership of Ukraine would be the next step to a nuclear war. We don't understand why we should risk the security of Hungary and Europe for one of the most corrupt, dysfunctional states in the world, a state that oppresses its own minorities. It is a priority for Hungary to stay out of this war and end the conflict immediately. If the price of the peace is that Ukraine has to give up the territories where Russian-speaking people who want to belong to Russia live, it must be accepted. Ukraine must also be made interested in peace. But as the media personality Tucker Carlson said, it is pretty clear that Zelensky has no interest in freedom and democracy. There is no hope to solve the issue. Mm-hmm. I must say that also the West is highly responsible for the escalation of the situation. Since the events of Maidan, many actions have been taken to further inflame tensions. So instead of provoking Russia with providing Ukraine with tons of weapons, they should encourage or push Ukraine and Russia to go back to the negotiating table. And several high-profile international public figures, such as Henry Kissinger, Jürgen Habermas, or John J. Mearsheimer, have warned for the need of a more measured stance on the conflict with regard to international stability and own national interests.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've touched on this already in your previous answer. Now, Budapest has raised concerns about Ukraine's treatment of ethnic Hungarians and has said that the situation must improve for Kiev to join the EU and NATO, you said. Now, do you think Kiev has addressed Hungary's concerns?
Kiev does not seem indifferent only to Budapest concerns, but the Ukrainian leadership is reluctant to guarantee even the most basic minority rights to Hungarians, Romanians, Russians, and other minorities in Ukraine, and is even trying to restrict their existing rights, especially in the area of language use. Kiev's anti-minority measures have clearly contributed to provoking the war. They feel the support of the USA, and for them it's not important what the real situation of the Hungarian minority is. And unfortunately, the double standards of the US and the EU are clear, and this makes their policy discredited. Mm-hmm. A Hungarian human rights watchdog NGO called National Legal Defense Service have observed and documented the violations of Hungarians' rights living in subcarpathian area in many cases. Their 50-page long report came to the conclusion of Ukraine severely violating the rights of indigenous Hungarians living in Subcarpathia, both in regard their ethnic minority rights and their personal and communal rights.
Now, finally, I just want to get your thoughts on one last thing, Dora, if I may. Jens Stoltenberg said in a statement that all members of the NATO alliance must accept that Ukraine's future is within the military bloc. Now, where does that leave member states who have their own different opinions to that?
The NATO is a military and political alliance with decision-making. So if there is a really strong pressure from the leaders of the alliance, the member states has their own opinion, and they have to give their approval. In the whole conflict, the subordination of European interests to US interests is not only manifested in NATO, but also in the EU. Unfortunately, Europe is now losing Russia as one of its most important export markets and one of its most reliable suppliers of cheap energy and raw materials, without which its competitiveness in the world market will be severely damaged. This certainly cannot be Europe's interest. So a strategic rethink is needed, and an autonomous European position that does not subordinate itself to US interests So the primary interest of Europe is peace, bringing the warring parties to the negotiating table and reaching an agreement.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dúró Dóra, Hungarian Deputy Parliament Speaker, thanks very much for finding the time to speak to us today on RT and for sharing your thoughts with us on the situation in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.